Okay, everyone, I have 6:30, so we're going to go ahead and get started. As way of introduction, my name is Angie Mack, and I am in the Reader Engagement Department here at Mid-Continent Public Library. I want to welcome you to this virtual program. Our program tonight is The Exorcism of Roland Doe, and with our presenter, Lucas Schwartz. So we're happy to be able to offer this program tonight. Before I turn it over to Lucas, I need to go over a couple of quick housekeeping things. First of all, I want to ask if you could do us a favor and put in the chat if you have more than one person watching on your device tonight. So if you have a couple of people or a group of people, go ahead and throw in the chat how many people are with you. That'll help me take attendance. Also, I want to ask you to do what you're doing and keep your microphones muted throughout our presentation. That's going to help cut down on our background noise and help us all hear our presenter better. I want to remind you to put any questions that you might have throughout tonight's program in the chat box. We'll have some time to go over the chat, questions in the chat at the end of tonight's program. So go ahead and throw your questions there. Even if you think it might be answered later, go ahead and put it in there just in case Lucas doesn't answer it and he can answer at the end. Also throughout the chat, I'm going to put in a link to a digital evaluation. If you could fill that out for us, it would help us. We read everyone, and we want to know what our attendees think about our content, how we succeeded, how we might have missed the mark, and what you might like to see in the future. So we're always looking for suggestions for upcoming virtual programs. Finally, I just want to let you know that I will be sending out an email tomorrow to everyone who registered. That email is going to have several things in it. It'll have a link to the evaluation again. It will have a link to our recording. We are recording tonight, so it'll have a link so you can watch this program again on YouTube if you'd like to. And it will also have some registration links for upcoming programs that you might be interested in. We have a lot of, we offer as many virtual programs as we can. And we have programs on exploring Western Provence, Latinx in Hollywood, gluten-free living, exploring Lake Michigan and Lake Superior, and horror movies that are so bad they're frightening. So we have a wide range of virtual program offerings coming up in October. We'd love to see you at all of them. I'm going to throw those links in the email tomorrow, so be on the lookout for that. So that's all of my housekeeping. Now I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker. So Lucas Schwartz is here with us, and he has been a park historic specialist with the Missouri State Museum since December of 2015, providing interpretation on a variety of topics relevant to Missouri's history and natural resources. So Lucas has a BA in archaeology from Washington University in St. Louis and an MA in anthropology from the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. So I am going to turn it over to Lucas. Lucas, thanks so much.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everyone. So as you said, I'm one of the Parks and Historic Site Specialists for the Missouri State Museum here in the beautiful Capitol building here in Jeff City. So we're talking today about the Exorcism of Roland Doe. And, it's the basis of the movie The Exorcist, which is a pretty popular film. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So The Exorcism of Roland Doe. Now, I'm sure most of you have seen The Exorcist. It's, like I said, a very popular film. But a thing that a lot of folks don't realize is not only was it based on a true story, it's based on a true story set here in Missouri. It actually happened in St. Louis. Now, while discussing this case, I'm going to go ahead and continue using the pseudonym Roland Doe, or Rob. He's also been called, Robbie Mannheim, things like that. But while his real identity was eventually dug up by reporters in 2005, he lived his entire life in fear of being discovered as the inspiration for that hit movie, The Exorcist. So kind of in respect to his own personal wishes, I'm going to go ahead and continue using the pseudonym. Now, in 1973, when The Exorcist was released, it blew away the film studio's expectations. They'd only planned to release it in a few dozen theaters. They weren't really expecting it to be very popular, and they really hadn't planned on a national release. But the reactions that they got from the audiences quickly let them know they had to expand it nationally. Now, what the audiences saw just absolutely shocked and horrified them. People were running out of the theater screaming, and a lot of them considered it not only the scariest film that they'd ever seen up to that point, but eventually the movie would be considered one of the best horror films of all time. Furthermore, this is actually considered a top grossing film. Not only was it really rare for horror films to be super popular, but it's very rare for them to bring in the kind of money The Exorcist was bringing in. It would later be nominated for a Best Picture Academy Award, and while it didn't win that award, it did win awards for the Best Adapted Screenplay and Best Sound Mixing. Now, in spite or perhaps because of its reputation as such a scary film, audiences were left in lines going out the theater. They'd often be stuck in these lines for upwards of 4 hours. And remember, this film released in December of 1973, so they're out there in the cold winter days and nights, bundled up against the chilly weather, just trying to get in and see a showing of this film. And that's all despite how little marketing was planned for this film. In fact, it was said that a lot of theaters, they had to hire guards and set up these barricades in order to help keep the lines orderly and keep people out of the streets. And enterprising concessionaires, they'd often set up booths alongside the line in order to sell food and drink to the people waiting to get in. In fact, it also wasn't uncommon to see groups of people seated on blankets, kind of like they're out on a picnic, just playing cards while they're waiting because they knew they were going to be there for upwards of 4 hours. But what made this such a popular film? Things might be different today, but back then, this certainly wasn't the face of popularity. And like I said, the film was given very little marketing because the expectation was really low amongst the film studios. On top of that, the image was quite disturbing for the time. Certainly no one was looking at pea soup the same way after they'd seen the film. Well, ultimately, it was word of mouth and later press coverage about the audience reactions that's what really drove the popularity of this film. There were countless reports of people in the audience fainting during the showing. In fact, we got a picture here, one of the gentlemen with his partner out in the theater lobby after she'd fainted during a screening. In fact, fainting became such a common phenomena that the theaters had to start carrying smelling salts in order to revive people after they'd passed out during a screening of the film. There were also a lot of reports of people vomiting during screenings, so much so that the theaters had to start carrying vomit bags, and Mad Magazine even picked up on it with their issue here, extolling the Exorcist barf bag, just in case the devil makes you do it. Now, of course, with these people being sent out of the theater early after spending 4 hours in line, that really kind of drew a lot of attention. And the newsroom soon picked up on that. And they started sending reporters down to these theater lobbies to interview the folks who'd spent 4 hours in line to watch a movie that they left 20 minutes into because they just couldn't handle how scary it was. And it was pretty common during these interviews to hear people shrieking in the background. Now, ultimately, news coverage of the audience reaction to The Exorcist ended up getting so big that number of journalists who were working on the ongoing Watergate scandal at that time began complaining that coverage of the audience reaction to The Exorcist was overshadowing Watergate. But one of the things that really shocked audiences when they got in and saw it, if you've seen the film recently, you might remember it's got that notice on it that says based on a true story. Now, the film was based on a novel written by William Peter Blatty. He did the screenplay for it as well. And he ended up basing his novel off of a real exorcism case that he read about in 1949 while he was a student at Georgetown University. Now, Georgetown University was a Jesuit university, and Jesuits will play pretty prominently in this story. And it said that he even managed to obtain a copy of the diary kept by one of the priests who was doing the exorcism. And he used that diary as kind of the basis for his story. Now, he did interview one of those priests as well, and he agreed to change up details in the novel once he explained to them what he was doing the research for. So, he set the entire story in Washington, D.C., and he made his main character a 12-year-old girl. However, the exorcism that actually inspired him to write this novel was based around a 13-year-old boy from Maryland who was exorcised by priests in St. Louis. Now, one of the similarities that a lot of people kind of point out between the fictional case and the actual cases, people tend to think that the exorcism case may have started off with the child playing with an Ouija board. Now, I do want to stop and give you all a warning here. A lot of the information that we got from before the boy was moved to St. Louis has all been passed down by word of mouth. So there tends to be a lot of tall tales in this situation. We've got people who oftentimes not even the person who witnessed it, retelling this story. And each time they retell it, it gets a little bit more exaggerated. The 6-inch fish eventually becomes a 12-inch fish. So just want to take things with a grain of salt here. Now, I mentioned that it started off with the boy playing with the Ouija board. That has its roots in old St. Louis spiritualism. So St. Louis was this kind of hotbed for spiritualist activity back at the end of the 19th century. And for those of you who don't know what spiritualism is, back around the year 1848, the Fox sisters, these two little girls out in New York, they started hearing this kind of knocking sound, and they realized that they could kind of communicate with it. They set up the code, 1 knock for yes, 2 knocks for no. And it really kicked off this movement of mediums popping up all over the country claiming that they could communicate with the dead. Originally started off as the knockings or the spirit rappings, they called it. It later evolved into table turning or table tipping. And then when the Ouija board was invented, they all really picked up on the Ouija board. And the spiritualist movement went from about 1848 till near the end of World War I. So about 1917, 1918, it was still fairly popular. And then it really faded quickly from there. However, St. Louis ended up being this kind of stronghold for spiritualist activity. So spiritualism still maintains a foothold in St. Louis even today. There are still active spiritualist churches in St. Louis. And from around 1917 to 1930, you also have spiritualist authors in St. Louis popping up. And by spiritualist author, I don't mean that they are writing about spiritualism. Instead, they're claiming that ghosts were dictating books to them through the Ouija board. Now, best example of that is Pearl Curran here. She was active from 1917 till about 1930. Now, Roland Doe, that's the pseudonym I'm using for the young man. His Aunt Tilly was a very fervent spiritualist, and she grew up in St. Louis about the time that Pearl Curran was gaining international fame for her novels dictated through the Ouija board. And because she grew up in that environment, she really did kind of develop into a firm believer in spiritualism. She frequently would visit her brother and Roland in their Maryland home, and while she was there, she taught Roland how to use the Ouija board. Now, a lot of people, like I said, they kind of blame his use of the Ouija board as what would eventually trigger the events that happened in 1949. And from here, we're actually going to kind of take a look at the timeline of events as they happened. So it all really started off on January 15th of 1949. Now, the boy Roland, he was home alone with his grandmother. So it's just the two of them, and they hear this dripping sound. Now, of course, they're starting to check all the faucets, the sinks, trying to figure out where the dripping sound is coming from. Wasn't any of the faucets or sink, though. So they followed their ears, kind of listening real close, and eventually they tracked it down to originating in the grandmother's bedroom. When they get into her bedroom, they also start hearing a scratching sound. And Grandma, like a lot of folks back then did, had a picture of Jesus up on the wall. Well, they noticed that the picture began shaking. They're thinking, okay, maybe there's rats or something in the floorboard scratching, and it got into the wall and it bumped the wall, making the picture shake. So they let Mr. Doe know, and he decided to go ahead and contact an exterminator. Well, exterminator looked around, didn't see any sign of rodents, but he went ahead and put down poison anyways. So for the next 10 days, every night from 7 o'clock to midnight, they'd hear this scratching sounds. Then after 10 days, the scratching stopped, and they figured, okay, that's great, rats are dead. Well, 3 days later, the boy starts to hear a new sound. He describes it as sounding like squeaking sneakers walking back and forth along his bedside. Well, in the middle of all this, January 26th, Aunt Tilly dies. Now, Roland is absolutely devastated. He was really, really close to his Aunt Tilly. And Mrs. Doe, she decides that this must be Aunt Tilly involved somehow. Aunt Tilly was the spiritualist. She believed very much that the dead and the living could communicate. So she thinks, okay, it makes sense. This is Aunt Tilly trying to reach out from the great beyond to communicate with us. So one night, Roland, Mrs. Doe, and the grandmother were all on Roland's bed while they were hearing these noises. And she decides to test it out. She says, okay, if this is Aunt Tilly, knock 3 times. Well, they describe being hit with a big gust of wind, 1, 2, 3 times. And with each gust of wind, there was a knock, 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's kind of weird here. Let's confirm this. If you really are Aunt Tilly, knock 4 times. Well, again, there are 4 big gusts of wind, and with each gust of wind, there's a knock. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, we're thinking this is Aunt Tilly haunting us. However, shortly after that, claw-like scratch marks appeared in the bed mattress. And then the bed starts shaking violently. And the bed covers, which had been tucked in underneath that mattress, suddenly flew out from under the mattress and stood straight out like they'd been starched. And according to Mrs. Doe, they stayed sticking out like that till she went to touch it, and it suddenly dropped like a puppet with its strings cut. So at school and over the rest of the month, the noises and the shaking bed continue, but at school, his desk actually starts to move around with him sitting in it. Now, he was absolutely insistent. I'm not doing this. This isn't me. And his mother, Mrs. Doe, would later go on to claim that the desk was actually sliding around like the planchet on a Ouija board. Of course, that's a little too disruptive for him to be in the classroom with all the other students. He was eventually removed from school. And at home, coat hangers began flying out of the closet. And at one point, they say that a Bible sitting on the bookshelf flung itself off the bookshelf to land at Roland's feet. Well, at this point, they decide to start taking Roland to doctors and psychiatrists to see if there's something physically or mentally wrong with him. And none of the doctors can find anything that's wrong with him. However, they did note he was kind of high strung. However, with all of this going on, I might be kind of high strung too. Now, jumping ahead to February 17th, they've been going to the doctors and the psychiatrists for a while, so they decided to try their minister. Now, the family was Lutheran, so they went to their minister in the Lutheran church. His name was Reverend Luther Schulz. And Reverend Schulz, he agrees to kind of look into the boy's case. Now, by this point, the boy's nights have become really, really fitful. In addition to the bed shaking, he was often going into these violent seizures. Well, Schulz, he was a big believer in the paranormal, and he thought that maybe this is a poltergeist case. So he decided, okay, I'm going to have the boy come over to my house and spend the night at my house, because in poltergeist cases, the phenomenon never leaves the afflicted person's home. So he brings him to his home that night, February 17th, sets him to bed. But while they were laying in bed, the bed began shaking again. Okay, well, he wants to try a couple other things out here. He decides to set up a pallet of blankets on the floor to see if anything happens with Roland sleeping on the pallet of blankets. So he sets this up, the boy starts going to sleep, but soon the pallet of blankets begins sliding around on the floor before being dragged underneath the bed. Well, at this point, Schulz is kind of at a loss for what to do. He's not sure what to make of this because, again, it's not classic poltergeist behavior. Roland goes home. The nights continue on like they had been. The bed keeps shaking. He keeps going into these violent seizures. And then on March 26th, scratch marks begin appearing on his arms, legs, and chest. Now, the scratch marks were said to resemble those of a cat's claws or thorns. And if any of you haven't been out in a thorn bramble here recently, here's what thorn scratches look like. Now, at this point, Schulz changed his opinion. He's not thinking poltergeist anymore. In fact, he's reported to have told the family, look, you all need to contact the Catholics. The Catholics know how to deal with this. So the family does eventually get in contact with the Catholic Church. They make contact with Father Edward Hughes from the St. James Catholic Church. And they call on him to kind of consult about with the case. Now, the Catholics, they don't go straight into exorcism when they hear about things like this. They want to make sure that it's not mental health related. There's no physical cause for it. So he starts off fairly mild. Of course, they've done the doctors and the psychiatrists. So he says, okay, well, here, I'm going to give you some holy water and some blessed candles to use around the house. Well, Mrs. Doe, she goes around the house sprinkling the holy water. However, according to her, after she set that bottle of holy water down on one of the countertops, the bottle flew off the countertop against the wall. A little freaked out. I'll show you. So he's going to try the blessed candles now. Now, according to her, while she was walking around the house with the blessed candle, suddenly the flame from the candle shot up to the ceiling. Now, a fellow named Thomas Allen wrote a book on this possession case, and according to him, at one point, Roland even spoke to Father Hughes in Latin, stating, "O priest of Christ, you know that I'm the devil. Why do you keep bothering me?" Now, that wasn't actually recorded anywhere as far as we know, so it's entirely possible that's another one of those tall tales. Thomas Allen then writes that Father Hughes, based on all the stuff that's going on, decided to approach the Archbishop of Washington to request an exorcism. Now, there is absolutely no documentation about an exorcism attempt, and the priests in St. Louis weren't aware of a previous exorcism attempt. So it's certainly possible that it never happened, but there are a lot of stories about it. However, before we get into those stories, I do want to give you our tallest tale warning. Like I said, there are no records, only secondhand accounts of what happened from this point onwards. Father Hughes himself never actually gave an interview, but the story goes that he told one of his fellow priests about the story shortly before his passing. And then that priest, Father Bobber, has been very vocal about, what happened during this case. So it's possible, but again, it's also possible that the tale's just been exaggerated through word of mouth so long that's entirely fictional. Now, the story goes, though, that on February 28th, Roland checked into Georgetown University Hospital for several days. And one of the more skeptical researchers I looked through did confirm that Roland did check in under his own name for those few days. So we do know he was at the Georgetown University Hospital. Now, the story goes that while he was there, Father Hughes attempted an exorcism case, or an exorcism. And Roland, during the exorcism, managed to snap a bed spring off from inside the mattress. He worked his arm free from restraints, slid it down into that mattress, and broke off that bed spring, and then he used that bed spring to slash Father Hughes's arm from elbow to wrist, causing a wound so bad he had to have over 100 stitches. Now, again, that skeptical researcher, Mark Otasnik, he looked into the story and found that it most likely didn't happen because he was able to find several parishioners from Father Hughes's church who don't ever remember him being injured that year. And he did teach PE and the junior baseball league, so he was very physically active, and none of them ever require him not being able to do his duties in those capacities. And in 2000, one of the St. Louis priests, Father Halloran, gave an interview on the Dave Glover Show, and he said that while it's certainly possible that there was an exorcism attempt in which the priest was injured, he said at most he may have stuck him with the spring, which caused some minor blood poisoning, but certainly nothing that would require stitches. Regardless, Roland was discharged from the hospital in the first week of March, and supposedly at that point, the family began debating whether or not they shouldn't leave town, go to see some relatives in St. Louis. In part, they were hoping the change of scenery would help to calm Roland down, and in part, Roland was screaming and throwing fits every night. They were getting kind of worried about what the neighbors might think about him. Now, this decision kind of got made for them because shortly after they began debating it, the word Lewis showed up scratched into the boy's abdomen. So March 9th, they made their trip out to St. Louis. They had several relatives out there that they were staying with. And for the first few days, things did seem to calm down. Now, the bed shaking stopped. Roland wasn't having his fits. Eventually, though, it did pick back up. Now, one of Roland's cousins, she was attending St. Louis University, and that's a fairly large Jesuit school out in St. Louis. If any of you have ever been out to St. Louis, you've surely heard of SLU. And she decided to approach one of the Jesuit priests who was serving as an instructor for one of her classes to ask if maybe he'd be willing to take a look into the case. Now, that priest was Father Raymond Bishop. And Bishop, he would become one of the central figures in this story because he was the priest who was charged with keeping the diary of the exorcism. Exorcisms were very, very rare at this point. So, in fact, the earliest exorcism before this one happened in the 1920s up in Erling, Iowa. And before that, they're looking through medieval records. So the church decided, okay, if we ever need to have another exorcism again, it'd be nice to have this diary to serve kind of as a guide for future exorcisms. Now, again, the Catholic Church doesn't go straight into exorcism. He decided to investigate the home. He went to the house itself and blessed the house to see if that would help things out. But unfortunately, didn't seem to have any effect. He even brought in a second-class relic of St. Margaret Mary. And a second-class relic is a relic that includes like a piece of cloth or clothing that the saint would have owned. But unfortunately, the boys, as soon as he went to bed, the bed began shaking and more scratches began appearing on his chest, and the commotion continued most of the night. So, jumping forward to March 11th, Bishop decides he's a little in over his head. So, he decides to bring in one of his friends. That would be Father William Bowdern. Now, Father Bowdern, he was this old, no nonsense priest. He actually served as an army chaplain during World War II. So, he'd seen a lot of stuff. He was very no nonsense, tough as nails priest. They both decide to visit the family on the evening of the 11th, and they brought with them a relic containing a bone fragment from St. Francis Xavier. So this time we're getting a first class relic, since it actually includes a piece of the St. Francis Xavier's forearm. Now they stayed with the family till Roland went to bed. But once he began yelling for help, they all rushed to the room. And he claimed that the relic of St. Margaret Mary had come unclasped from his pillow and flown across the room, hitting the mirror on the other side, and that's what woke him up. Well, they calmed Roland down, reattached the St. Margaret Mary relic, and then they attached the St. Francis Xavier relic. After he calmed down, was settling back to go to sleep, they headed back downstairs. Shortly thereafter, though, they heard a crash from upstairs, and Roland began yelling for help again, so they all rushed back up the stairs. This time when they got there, Roland claimed that a bottle of holy water had flown across the room from one of the dressers that had been left on. Well, they calm him down again, go back downstairs while he's drifting off to sleep. Only this time, they hear something heavy being dragged across the floor from upstairs and a crash, and he's yelling for help again. When they get up the stairs this time, they actually can't get the door open because a heavy bookcase had dragged itself in front of the door and was blocking it. They finally did manage to, kind of shoulder their way into the room. And when they got in there, in addition to the bookcase having moved, one of the stools that was set up at a dresser had slid across the room. The St. Francis Xavier relic had moved from the pillowcase to the foot of the bed, and the Margaret Mary relic was lost, and they never did recover that relic. Now, they rearranged all the furniture back where it belongs, though they did say that when they returned the stool to the desk that it came from, it flipped itself back over again. And at this point, the priest decided to petition Archbishop Ritter of St. Louis for an exorcism. So starting on March 16th, they finally got the permission to start the exorcism, and they began reading the exorcism rites that night. Now, they decided to bring along with them a young Jesuit scholastic. And a Jesuit scholastic means he's currently in school studying to be a priest, but he's not quite a priest yet. That's a 28-year-old Father Walter Halloran. Now, they brought Halloran along mostly because he was a football player for the university and wanted to have some muscle available in case they needed someone to hold the boy down should he become violent during the exorcism. Now, as they started reading the prayers of the exorcism, at the very first Praecipio, I command, and all mentions of Jesus, Mary, or St. Michael, scratch marks would appear on the boy's body. Now, they'd show up on his legs, his stomach, his back, his face, or throat. They were bright red, and they'd often form welts. Now, some of them even formed words. No, of course, not itchy here. I've just got this as an example, but one of the words that formed was the word hell written on the boy's chest in such a manner that he could look down and read it. They say that over the course of the night, more than 25 marks would appear across his body. And some of them were even deep enough to cause blood to run. And one of the more disturbing scratch marks that appeared supposedly formed the portrait of the devil with winged arms held up above his head. Now, as the night wore on, he continued being scratched until eventually he entered a trance-like state in which he began violently striking the bed. And at this point, he also began spitting, and he would spit in the faces of the priest. And it was said that even with his eyes shut tight, he could accurately hit a person in the face, even if they were using blankets or pillows to try to block it. And with him becoming more and more violent, they ended up trying to hold him down. And not just one, it took two grown men to hold this 13-year-old boy down. And he kept fighting like that until 7:30 a.m. in the morning. Now, the prayers of exorcism were read nightly. So every single night they'd come by to do the exorcism. And if he hadn't fallen asleep by the end of it, they just started over again. So they're repeating the exorcism over and over throughout the night until Roland falls asleep. And with every night that passed, his reactions became more and more violent. He eventually took to using vulgar language to curse the priest. He was spitting and urinate all over himself, and he was violently striking the bed. It's said that many of the things that he actually said during the exorcisms were fouler than the language used by Reagan in the film The Exorcist. And it always required at least 2 men to restrain him every night. Now, by March 21st, though, the family was kind of reaching their breaking point. They'd been kept up all night watching their kid go through this. So the priest decided they're going to send Roland to the mental health ward of the Alexian Brothers Hospital for a night in order to allow the family to rest. They also felt it'd be helpful to get him someplace where they could more easily restrain him, since, of course, they've got the beds with the restraints in the mental health ward. And then the rest of the family, they were to stay home while he underwent the exorcism there. Now, it's said that when Roland showed up at the hospital room, he was extremely fearful of his surroundings. He's being put into a padded room on a bed with restraints. There's bars on the windows, and the door has no door handle on the inside, so it looks like he's being committed. Now, they read the exorcism prayers that night, but got absolutely no reaction. So, we're thinking, yeah, maybe he was a little too scared of being committed to go into this reaction here. However, they did release him back to his family home the next day, and that night he had another fit. So at this point, the priest decided, okay, well, he's obviously super stressed out and fearful of being put in the mental health ward. Maybe we can set up a room for him in the rectory of College Church on the SLU campus. That way he's not feeling like he's being committed, but at the same time, we're getting him away from the family so they can rest. They also decide they're going to try to start instructing Roland in the Catholic faith, as they're thinking, okay, maybe if we convert him to Catholicism, this will help to resolve the issue. Now, that night in the rectory of College Church was the most violent yet. There was lots of obscene language. He was prophesying, saying he could see some of the assistants or some of the other priests in hell in the year 1956 or 1957. He's also spitting and barking, urinating, and thrashing about. And at one point, Roland even managed to get an arm free from the people holding him down, and he promptly used that arm to break the nose of Father Halloran and to bloody the nose of another assisting priest, Father William Van Roo. Now, Roland was allowed to return to his family's home after this, and the spells continued each night during the exorcisms. So they ultimately decided, okay, well, he was baptized as a Lutheran, but maybe for whatever reason, the baptism didn't stick or it wasn't done properly, so we're going to do a do-over. We're going to baptize him again as a Catholic. They decided to do the baptism on April 1st and then have him take his first Holy Communion on April 2nd. Now, during the drive to the church, they're thinking, okay, we ought to be good. He only really has his fits at night. So they're doing this all during the day. But as they're driving out to the church on April 1st, suddenly the car radio stops working. It goes dead silent. And Roland from the back screams out, "So you're going to baptize me, haha. And you think you will drive me out with Holy Communion, haha." Then he lunged forward and grabbed the steering wheel, trying to crash the car. His uncle had to veer off to the side of the road, pull up on the curb while they tried to get Roland under control. At that point, the uncle and the father both got into the back seat with Roland to try to restrain him while the aunt took over driving. Unfortunately, the harrowing ride wasn't quite finished with yet, though. At one point, while the aunt's driving, he managed to break free from both his uncle and his father and grab her and try to crash the car a second time. And then once they finally reached the church at College Church and University or St. Louis University, it took 4 men to haul him out of the car. And while they had originally planned on taking him inside the cathedral here, they ultimately decided against that because, as you can see, this is the inside of College Church. Those big buildings like that, I can't even imagine the sound of the screams echoing throughout there. And they were afraid he might end up desecrating the church. So they hauled him off to the rectory again, and they hauled in some of the baptismal water. It said that it was only with much effort and generous amounts of holy water that they were able to complete the baptism. Now, the next day, they attempted the first Holy Communion, and for several hours, they'd place the holy wafer in his mouth, and he just spit it right out. Now, they kept attempting it until, well, this is per Father Halloran's interview. He later said that during the first Holy Communion attempt, at one point the boy jumped up and punched Father Bodern in the groin, yelling, "How's that for a nutcracker?" They decided to take a break for a couple hours after that, and they did much praying. And after all the praying, they were finally able to get the boy to consume the communion wafer. However, he continued to have fits nightly, even after receiving communion. In fact, he often took to breaking the ceiling lights for the room that he was in, so the rooms ended up being kind of unnaturally dark. And he became so violent, they decided to start forcing him to wear gloves, and they taped the gloves together so he couldn't hurt himself or any of the other people around him. Now, due to how much work Mr. Doe had been missing by this point, the family decided they needed to return to Maryland. The priest went with them to continue doing the exorcism the entire time, and they were also committed to looking for maybe a place a little closer to home that'd be willing to take over the exorcism case. Of course, who wants to take over an exorcism case? Now, when they got to Maryland, they did contact Father Hughes at St. James Church, and they asked for his assistance. And while he was cooperative with helping them look for someone who'd be willing to take over the case, he himself was adamantly refusing to take over the case. They also tried Georgetown University Hospital, as that's a Jesuit hospital around the Washington, D.C. area, but since they receive a lot of their funding from federal funding, they were worried that if they took in an exorcism case, the federal funding might get cut off, so they refused to take him in as well. Now, ultimately, at their wits' end, they decided to return to St. Louis with Roland and his mother, leaving the father behind so he could resume work. And they contacted the Alexian brothers and arranged to have a room for long-term care set up for him in the mental health ward of the hospital. Now, again, Roland, he wasn't confined completely to the hospital. You know, they didn't want him to feel like he was a committed patient, but he did start having fits more and more frequently during the day. Now, they would occasionally take him out on day trips, though, just to kind of get him out of the hospital environment for a little bit. One of those day trips was actually to the White House Jesuit retreat on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River. Now, Father Halloran took him out there because he'd actually kind of formed a friendship with the boy, and he was taking him along one of the walking trails outside the retreat center. And along that trail, they've got these big statues depicting the stations of the cross. According to Father Halloran, when they reached the 12th station of the cross, the boy suddenly went into one of his fits. He closed his eyes tightly and he bolted for the edge of the bluff. Thankfully, Father Halloran was in pretty good shape, being an athlete and all. He would later quip in some of his interviews that, for once in my life, I made a decent tackle. Now, at this point, Roland also more frequently began speaking as the devil. Now, he would claim as the devil that he would no longer allow Roland to receive Holy Communion. And on Easter Sunday, he said that he would not allow Roland to attend Mass, at which point he went into such a violent seizure that they weren't able to drag him out to the Mass. At this point, the Alexian brothers, they are, of course, a religious order, they decided to dedicate round-the-clock devotions to Our Lady of Fatima and St. Michael for Roland's recovery. They even bought some statuary towards that effort. The picture in the center here is a big statue of Our Lady of Fatima. That's actually the statue in the Alexian Brothers Hospital today. That's the statue that was bought for this purpose. On the right is just an example. We've got a St. Michael who they bought a statue of as well, since he was pretty well known for being able to drive off evil. And finally, Easter Monday. The Monday right after Easter started off like a lot of the other days had, with violence and cursing. Now, at one point, since they weren't able to get him to consume the communion wafer, they were having him do spiritual communions in which they'd ask, do you accept Christ? And all he has to say is, I do, in order for it to count. They managed to get Roland to successfully complete a spiritual communion when a voice pops up from Roland saying, that isn't enough. He has to say one more word. One little word. I mean, one big word. He'll never say it. And then he went through more of his fits throughout the entire day. Much violence, cursing, thrashing about, urinating, barking. However, by about 10:45 that night, a new voice was suddenly heard from Roland. And that voice exclaimed, Satan, Satan, I am Saint Michael, and I command you, Satan, and the other evil spirits to leave the body in the name of Dominus. Immediately, now, now, now. After several minutes of seizure, Roland suddenly relaxed and exclaimed, he's gone. And then from that point, he described seeing a scene of a man in a robe with armor and a fiery sword who came and drove the devil into a cave and sealed it shut. Now, in one later interview, Father Halloran claimed that some of the people from a nearby church, they heard this report like a gunshot going off at the time it happened, and the the college church at St. Louis University lit up brightly when it happened. Now, by the next day, Roland claimed he had no memory of what had happened to him during the possession. And he never again had one of his spells. He grew up normally, had a family of his own. Father Halloran, in one of his interviews, noted that he kept in contact with Father Bowdern while Bowdern was still alive. Bowdern actually ended up officiating his wedding. And Roland named his first son after the Archangel Michael. And then Roland passed away in 2020. But now for the $1,000,000 question, was he actually possessed? And ultimately, that's going to depend on who you're asking. You know, psychiatrists will say he was just a troubled young man seeking attention. Especially convincing is the fact that after he was removed from school, the incidents almost always happened only at night. And then he would sleep in late and spend his day reading comic books, playing board games, and eating ice cream. And during the time in St. Louis, his parents at one point had suggested maybe putting him back in school since the incidents were only happening at night, you know, because they didn't want him to get too far behind on his studies. However, shortly after the suggestion was made to put him back in school, the words "no school" showed up etched into his abdomen. Now, of course, if this was a prank that was gone too far, it may be that after he realized he was being kept in the mental health ward of the Alexian Brothers Hospital long term, he may have decided it was time to end the charade lest he end up a permanently committed patient. Now, if you ask the Catholics, however, a lot of them would actually say this was a genuine case of possession. You know, when William Peter Blatty was getting ready to write the novel, he did contact Father Bowdern and he asked him, okay, 20 years later, do you still think that this was a legitimate possession? And Bowdern reportedly told him that he had absolutely no doubt it was the real thing. Now, while there weren't any cases of him speaking Latin recorded in the diary, that wasn't just him either trying to mimic the Latin or repeating back what was heard before telling the priest to stick it up their backsides. He did say that during his spells, it required multiple grown men to hold him down. Also, at one point, he was commanded to answer in Latin as part of the exorcism process, and he responded back, "No, I only speak in the voice of the possessed." And additionally, some of the scratch marks that appeared on his body were in places that would be rather hard for him to do on his own if he was inflicting them himself. In addition to that, there was also the movement of objects in front of witnesses. So, like Father Halloran said that one day while he was kneeling on the bed praying, a bottle of holy water flew past his head. He also claimed on another occasion when he was leaning on the bed suddenly started levitating 8 inches off the floor. Now, it's really hard to tell fact from fiction in this case, though, and part of that's because a lot of the facts were obscured over the years, but in addition to that, there may have been quite a bit of exaggeration helping to really beef up the story because something that might not super interesting, oh, the bed was shaking, suddenly becomes, oh, the bed was levitating. And there may have been some intentional misdirection by the individuals involved in order to help protect the anonymity of the boy. Now, for example, it was often reported that the possessed boy was originally from Mount Rainier, Maryland. And that rumor actually became so persistent that the people in Mount Rainier themselves began to believe it. You know, they'd have friends or family from out of town come in and they'd look at the house on the corner and say, oh, look, there's the Exorcist house. A lot of the local youth would begin daring themselves to sleep over in the house overnight. Ultimately, that all had to come to a stop. So the community of Mount Rainier used the house as a test subject for burning or to test some of the firemen in a house that was burning. So they burned it down as part of that training exercise. Now, Mark Kopsasnik, he did a little bit digger deep. He dug a little deeper and he discovered that the boy was actually from Cottage City, Maryland. And since he found out the boy's address, he figured out the name. He tried contacting the young man. Well, he's really old by this point. And the fellow told him, look, don't ever call me again, and immediately hung up on him. So he started looking around into the community, and he found the names of some of the young men who grew up with that boy. He actually managed to find a fellow who was reportedly his best friend growing up and that best friend's brothers, and he was able to interview them. Now, the brothers of the best friend, they attested in their interview that Roland had developed a method for spitting accurately up to 10 feet away, well before the exorcism case had ever happened. So all those reports of him spitting in the faces of the priests, it may be something he'd practiced when he was younger. Additionally, they said that back then, those beds were on, they all had a bed springs in them, and they're all on rollers. So it wouldn't have taken very much movement, possibly imperceptible movement on the part of the boy in order to make it look like the whole bed was shaking. Now, the boy who was described as being Roland's best friend, he admitted in an interview that Roland was an only child raised by an oppressively religious mother, and he was heavily influenced by his spiritualist aunt. Furthermore, he claimed that Roland was kind of a loner and a bully, and that the desk shaking or moving incident wasn't sliding around, it was just shaking really violently. Now, with him being kind of a loner and bully, he did have reasons to not want to be in school. And after the case kind of went public back in the early 2000s, Father Halloran, he gave quite a few interviews, but he would never in an interview claim that he felt it was an actual case of possession. You know, he always said he couldn't go on record because he didn't feel like he was qualified to speak to that, even though he was there. In fact, he had his nose broken by the possessed boy. And as for Roland himself, like I said, no one could ever interview him, but after he passed away in 2020, a woman came forward saying that she'd been his companion for the last 29 years, and she gave an interview with the New York Post. Now, in that interview, she said that Roland, he would never say that he was possessed. He'd always say that he just believed he was a very bad boy. However, if he was just a bad boy, he certainly paid for it for the rest of his life, as he'd spend his life, like I said, afraid that people were going to figure out he was the inspiration for The Exorcist. Now, he had a successful career working for NASA. He was actually one of the engineers that helped with the Apollo mission. So he helped put men on the moon, and he was afraid he'd face public ridicule and see his career go just down the drain if they figured out he was the kid behind The Exorcist. And every Halloween, he was so fearful of people coming up to ask about it, he'd leave his house and be gone the entire night just in case someone were to come up to the door to knock and ask about it. There was one more curious thing that happened with his life, though. Like I said, he passed away in 2020, and shortly before he passed, a Catholic priest showed up to administer the last rites, even though no one had called a priest to come in and administer the last rites. And in fact, Roland hadn't been a practicing Catholic in a number of years at that point, so no one knew how the priest knew to come by and do the last rites. Now, either way, whether you believe he was just a troubled youth or a possessed boy, it certainly makes for a good, scary story. Now, I've got time for some questions if anyone has any questions.
We don't have any questions yet in the chat. If you can think of something before we wrap up tonight, please go ahead and put them there, and we'll get to as many as we can. Yeah, I don't know, scary story or something more. I don't know, Lucas. Is there any for further investigation or further reading? Is there any titles, anything written on this young man and this incident that you would recommend?
Now, there are two really good sources I'd recommend. First is the book Possessed by Thomas Allen. He wrote the entire book about the case, so he definitely tends to lean more towards the believer side of things. If you'd like to get the more skeptical point of view, Mark Opsasnick's article in Strange Magazine, The Possessed Boy or The Haunted Boy of Cod City, Maryland. It's about a 5-page article that kind of takes a more skeptical look at things.
Okay. Did he marry and have children?
Yes, he did. Like I said,
so, has anyone talked to them? That's a question we have in the chat.
So, like I mentioned earlier, they did note that Father Bowden officiated his wedding, so he did marry, and he had 3 kids. A son, like I said, he named the son after the Archangel Michael, and he had 2 daughters. Though the companion who was interviewed in the New York Post noted that by the time of his passing, they were estranged. So there was some kind of tense family things going on there, and I don't think that they were very likely to talk about the case either. The whole family is very close-mouthed about it.
our audience wants to know what you think, Lucas. Do you think this young man was possessed? Was this a real exorcism or something else?
Now that's kind of a tough one. I'll admit I lean more towards the skeptic side of things, but I was also raised Catholic, so I kind of have this kind of tear in me. It's like, maybe it could have happened. But again, I tend to lean more skeptic.
Oh, fair enough. Let's see. As we wrap up here, anything since that case, which was as affected pop culture as powerfully, has anything been, ripped from the headlines or other than, Law and Order? I don't know.
Well,
Has anything captured the American attention as much as this incident did?
as much as this one, not quite. There have been other movies based on real exorcism cases, like the Exorcism of Annalise Michelle was fairly popular for films. Well, I think that was the Exorcism of Emily Rose was the movie they based off of that one. That was a case that happened out in Germany. And actually, it was after the movie was released, calls for exorcism with the Catholic Church skyrocketed. People were suddenly calling in asking for exorcisms like crazy. And they say that after 2020 with the COVID pandemic, that also led to a big spike in people calling and asking for exorcisms. But this was kind of the big case. If you look for actual exorcism cases, this is the one that really pops up.
Right. Did the young man involved get an engineering degree from college? How did his path take him to NASA?
That we don't really know about. Like I said, he refused to talk to the media at all. So we know next to nothing about his life after the exorcism case. And a large part of that was because he didn't want to be known as the kid who did the exorcism. We just know his career led him to NASA. He worked as an engineer at NASA, as I think he developed some of the heat resistant shielding that was used on the shuttle that was launched to the moon. But we don't know much about his personal life. He was very tight lipped about it.
Well, that's fair enough. Finally, questions. Have you seen the most recent adaptation of The Exorcist, the 2023?
I have not seen that one yet. I've been meaning to. It's on my list, but at the same time, I think it's kind of hard to beat the classic.
That's fair enough. Well, I want to thank everyone who came and stayed throughout the program. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something and have something to investigate further. So, Lucas, thanks so much for bringing this program to our Mid-Continent audience.
Yeah, thanks for joining me, everyone.
All right, everyone, good night. Thanks you.
Thanks very much.